We'll be joined first by my friend and the new director of the Department of Energy's Loan Program Office, Jigar Shah. Jigar joined the Biden administration's Department of Energy earlier this year to re-energize, pun intended, an office that lay dormant for the last 4 years under the Trump administration. Jigar was most recently co-founder and president at Generate Capital, where he focused on helping entrepreneurs accelerate decarbonization solutions through the use of low-cost infrastructure as a service financing. Prior to Generate Capital, he founded SunEdison, a company that pioneered pay-as-you-save solar financing. Jigar has seen financing of clean energy sources from nearly every vantage point, and he brings that experience to the Loan Program Office to help meet the president's goal of 100% clean electricity in the power sector by 2035, and to ensure that it's done in an equitable way and in a way that grows jobs and stimulates the economy. So with that, welcome, Jigar.
Thanks, Josh. Great to be here.
It's really great to have you. This has been a long time coming. So let's start with the basics. Can you give our audience the top line of what the Loan Program Office does and why it's so important to reaching our goal of getting to net zero in the United States by 2050?
The Loan Programs Office has been around since 2005. It was most active in 2010 and 2011, issuing about $35 billion in loans. And the losses have been far lower than anyone thought was possible when investing in new technologies. I think that when you think about where we are going next, we have about $40 billion of additional capacity across renewable energy, nuclear, and fossil in the Title 17 program, which is largely project finance. Then we have got another $17.5 billion in ATVM, the Advanced Technology Vehicle Manufacturing Program, and then about $2 billion in the Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program. In short, what I would say is that we're really the arm of the Department of Energy that focuses on commercialization and focuses on building that bridge to bankability. I think we all recognize that if we're really going to tackle climate change, that we need to be at trillion-dollar scale, right? That's the only scale that really matters to get carbon emissions to come down at the speed and scale that people are talking about going into Glasgow. And so the question becomes, how do we get technologies that aren't solar, wind, lithium-ion batteries, electric vehicles at that scale? And that's really around building this bridge and getting everyone to buy into the bridge, right? Getting the private sector and others to all opt in so that we can get technologies commercialized faster.
You talk about sort of that being the bridge. Where in the innovation ecosystem does LPO do most of its work, and what stage of technology readiness is LPO really designed to support?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's across all four. So, on one side of the bridge is technology that has been proven in the lab, right? That's technology readiness 7. And then on the other side of the bridge is full commercial market participation, right? That's the solar and wind industry today. And so the 4 segments inside the bridge are really first of a kind deployment, right? You got to take lab scale technology and prove it works in the field. Then you've got to have engineering excellence, right? You got to actually be able to do it again in a second, third, fourth, fifth locations. And then you've got the learning curve, right? And that's where the Secretary's Earth shots come in, right? We're going to get stuff from here to there. And that means that we've already figured out how to build it, but it's too expensive. And we need to get the 7 cumulative doublings, right, that we've all learned about with the learning curve. And then the last part of the bridge is, the misunderstandings of the commercial debt markets, right? There's a lot of things that have come down the cost curve, and the commercial debt markets still don't see it as in their best interest to engage, right? And that is that last portion where it's really just inertia. But we play in all 4 areas, and frankly, most technologies have different companies that are in all 4 areas, whether it's energy storage or hydrogen production or transmission, technologies, or nuclear for that matter.
So talking about the role of the federal government in this, and particularly LPO, you've noted that the backing of the federal government through the Loan Program Office has certain advantages, but also can have some real limitations. Can you talk a little bit more about that as well as any actions that may be taken or you may be taking to address the limitations?
Well, look, I think that when you think about what the deployment curve and the commercialization curve looks like, when the private sector is the one leading and government is really the one supporting, it's a long cycle, right? As you know, Václav Smil or Bill Gates or others have talked about, that cycle is a 30, 40, 50-year cycle. We need to figure out how to shrink that down. And we have in solar, wind, lithium-ion batteries, et cetera. I'd say that in general, most of those sectors succeeded through really a powerful entrepreneur that was able to bring everyone together, right? In solar, I played a big role there along with others. In EVs, clearly Elon Musk has played a big role along with others. We can't wait for 40 of those people to exist in each of the sectors that the International Energy Agency has designated as needing to be fully commercialized. So the question really becomes, what role does government play in figuring out exactly how to get us on track, right? Before the commercial sector is actually decided, right? Because a lot of the commercial sector, frankly, hasn't engaged. You've got venture capitalists that have engaged, but you don't really have debt markets that have engaged. And we generally talk a lot about venture capital. This company is SPACed, this company raised a D round. It's fun and it's exciting, and I totally get it. But at $1 trillion scale, it's all about debt markets, right? It's not really about equity markets. And so the real question becomes, like, what does it take to get the debt markets to participate, right? And for them, what they want to know is that the government's going to be there through all 4 of the stages, right? Because if they build a first of a kind plant and they engage on the first of a kind plant, and then we don't build plant 2, 3, and 4, then you're never going to get there, right? And nuclear is plagued by this, right? We have a habit in nuclear of doing many first-of-a-kind deployments. We love first-of-a-kind deployments, right? But then the question becomes, how do you build up the supply chain such that you can build second, third, and fourth, and such that you can come down the learning curve, right? And I think the government has a key role of educating the marketplace. One, that nuclear can benefit from this, right? Because many people's experience with nuclear is building airports, not airplanes, right? And we need to move to airplanes, not airports, right? And so this whole custom, civil works project that nuclear has become is not a pathway through learning curve. But when you look at small modular reactor designs or microreactor designs, many of which are in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission process here in the United States, where we think that, by 2023, I think Oklo will have a preliminary approval for their design. I think when you look at NuScale and TerraPower and X-Energy, their approvals look like they'll come between 2025 and 2027. And so, as you know, in nuclear time, that's a very short amount of time. And so what are we doing to scale up the supply chain? What are we doing to make sure that when those approvals come in, that we can start deploying at scale?
And you talk about nuclear in part because it is one of the firm energy sources that IEA and others have referenced we need to complement renewables. Can you talk about a little bit more for anyone in the audience who might not be familiar with the vocabulary? How would you define the terms firm or dispatchable and intermittent? And from your vantage point, what are some of the hurdles remain that for firm technologies in particular?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, in general, let's be clear, right, that technology can accommodate almost any combination of resources, right? So if we want to build 100% solar and wind grid, we could, but we would need a whole bunch of infrastructure that had, between 150 and 300 hours of like battery storage to be able to handle the periods when you have low amounts of sun and low amounts of wind, right? And when that occurs, that equipment can be very expensive. So it could be cheaper to actually just mix in firm sources, right? And those firm sources should not only be firm, but also be flexible firm, right? So you need to have modern designs, like nuclear power plants can be allowed to come down and up in its production, but they haven't been built that way traditionally. And in the future, I think they could be built that way pretty easily. Geothermal power has similar characteristics. Low impact hydro has similar characteristics, but nuclear is one of the technologies that is not geographically required to be in certain spots, right? So you can imagine the politics of this too, right? We do have 200 to 400 power plants that have to be shut down in the United States over the next few years to be able to accommodate a decarbonized grid by 2035. And many of those towns rely on those plants for union workforce, for property tax payments, et cetera. And so you can imagine many of them are looking for solutions to play that role. But separately, I think to answer your question specifically, there are many studies that we've done at the Department of Energy, but others have done as well, that show that these flexible baseload plants greatly reduce the cost of creating a decarbonized grid. And so in order for that to occur, they have to be ready for prime time and have to be ready to be deployed, at scale.
And certainly, while we face those 300 to 400 plants in the United States that are need to be retired, in Europe, they face a similar challenge and in similar geographic distribution, with certain countries facing more of the load than others, just as in the U.S., certain states face more of the load of retiring plants than others. We talked a lot about technologies. Can you talk about business models for a moment? And are there certain business models that you're more excited about, or that you think would be a particularly good fit for the Loan Program Office?
Well, I don't know that there are certain business models that are better for the Loan Programs Office than others, but there should be a business model. I do find that there are some people who really are so interested in the technology side of this that they don't really think through, how does this integrate with utility regulation, right? In the United States, we've really resisted performance-based regulation, but Washington State has now demanded it occur. Oregon is now more open to getting it done. California is thinking about it. There's other folks that are like getting there, right? And so when you think about how all of these things interplay with each other, there needs to be a thoughtfulness around all of this, because that is what gives comfort to the private sector. Remember, we're building this bridge to bankability. So eventually I want to get out of this business. And so that means that the private sector has to come in at least at $100 billion scale, because that's the only scale that actually matters to get the cost down, right? Because if you're going to do these 7 or 8 cumulative doublings along the learning curve, and so that you want to get nuclear into the single digits and mid-single digits in terms of cost per kilowatt hour, you need $100 billion of deployment of these technologies. And so for those private sector players to want to participate, they're going to want to know, what is the regulatory construct going to look like? How are these resources going to be prioritized within transmission planning systems, right? Is it going to be a free-for-all where everyone gets access depending on their position in the queue? Or do different characteristics actually play a role in prioritizing the transmission queue and making some folks, get prioritized over other folks, right? Depending on the mix in that region. And so a lot of these issues go to the business model that you're talking about, because without those getting adjudicated, you don't see how you can attract $100 billion of private sector capital.
Yeah, that's extremely helpful. And it's nice to tie in the government role with ultimately getting this out to markets in the private sector and getting the government out of the business of this. One other part of this, given we do have an international audience, and our next panel also is going to be looking at the European side of this conversation as well as the US. How might firm technologies or technologies in general that receive LPO support in the US ultimately benefit Europe and other international markets?
Well, I think that Glasgow is about hope, right? And about execution and about doing. Right. I think there's a lot of hope and execution happening in solar, wind, lithium-ion battery production, in EV manufacturing. I think part of the reason why a lot of countries come to the table and are willing to compromise within the COP framework is because they view this as wealth creation for their countries. They view this as a way for them to bring industries of the future into their countries and get their scientists and their engineers and their best people to bring all of the strengths to the table, right? And that level of hope and optimism is what causes people to want to make a deal, right? And so I think it's important for all of us to recognize that we have a variety of different impacts from climate change, right? Whether it's weather patterns or whether it's access to different natural resources by which to combat climate change and live with climate change. And so each different country needs a suite of technologies. And so there are countries who are saying, look, wind and solar and batteries alone don't cut it for us, right? So they need for countries like the United States to lead and to be able to say, we do have a nuclear solution, right? You don't have to only get this from the Russians. You can actually get it from some other players, and you can do it this way. And here's the non-proliferation issues. You can also look at like enhanced geothermal technologies and a lot of the good work that's being done. Remember, we have all this skill that we created here in the United States through the fracking industry around Halliburton and Schlumberger and others around how to characterize the well and how to characterize how to, deal with all these micro technology issues, which many countries need expertise in, right? And so when you think about how we invest in these technologies within our country, it then provides a tremendous amount of confidence around our export markets and around the availability of this technology so that people can confidently make these bold claims around decarbonization and know that the technology exists as well as the wealth creation opportunities exist to be able to implement these technologies.
Well, that's a fantastic way to end it with that sort of optimism and international context. As always, Jigar, when we talk, I wish we had twice as much time as we were able to. Thanks so much, especially given how busy you are standing up the program and evaluating everything to give us the time that you were able to today. Really appreciate it and really enjoyed our conversation.